The first thing is, this is the question that people ask in Alberta and Saskatchewan and Newfoundland. And it's a perfectly sensible question, right? They should ask it because they are producing a lot of oil and gas in these three provinces. But it's interesting that this can end up being, or I think so far has been, an obstacle to making progress here, because when you look at the emissions that come from a barrel of oil, roughly 80% of the emissions come from the consumption of the oil when it's burned to produce energy, typically, and 20% come from the production of the oil. It's a little bit different depending on whether it's conventional oil and gas or oil sands, but it's basically 20-80. And what that tells me is that, you know, if you want to think about a carbon pricing policy, you probably want to focus it on the consumption of the oil and gas, because that's where the action is. And even if Alberta, for example, didn't produce a drop of oil or gas or oil sands or had no pipelines, they could still have a perfectly coherent discussion about carbon pricing, because we still drive cars and we still generate electricity by producing coal, by burning coal, and et cetera. So I think understanding the difference, the important difference between the consumption of fossil fuels and the production is really, really important. But then you say, so well, if we actually introduce carbon pricing, let's suppose we introduce carbon pricing at BC's current level. So BC has a $30 per ton carbon tax. You introduce the same tax in Alberta, that would obviously have, it would raise the price of carbon fuels and things that come from that. And it would produce all of the appropriate incentives to consume less. But it wouldn't let producers, of course, off the hook, because producers of oil and gas are also consuming oil and gas in their production process. And they are emitting about 13%, latest numbers, about 13% of Alberta's GHG emissions are coming from the production of oil and gas, a little bit more from upgrading and refining. A $30 per ton tax, according to Professor Andrew Leach at U of Alberta Business School, a $30 per ton tax would reduce cash flow in the oil and gas sector by about $3 a barrel, half of which would be reduced revenue to the provincial government because of the operation of the royalty system. So in fact, a $30 per ton tax would reduce free cash flow, after-tax cash flow if you like, in the oil patch by about $1.50 a barrel, $1.50 a barrel. So, you know, that's greater than nothing. That, you know, it would reduce profitability in the oil patch. But it's really hard to make the case that that $30 per ton tax would decimate the oil patch. There's always a marginal project. So it is going to, you know, it's going to lead to less development. But I think Albertans don't know that. And I think they need to know that. And I think if they did, they would realize that Alberta could have, and Saskatchewan and Newfoundland, could have a comprehensive, a sensible, comprehensive, and effective carbon price and still have a thriving oil patch. But I think in Alberta, I think the obstacle to this is the mindset that says oil is our birthright, oil is our economic prosperity, and anything you do in terms of carbon pricing would threaten it. And I think the truth is actually quite different. Well, so you've got a commodity, okay, as you suggested. So this, you know, the oil is of different grades, but we're selling this in world markets at prices that are beyond the control of Alberta, right? Alberta is producing 3.5 million barrels a day in a world of 85 to 90 million barrels a day. Prices are set in world markets. So it's the cost curve that matters. And as you know, a lot of Alberta's oil sands, and there's differences between in situ and mining, but they are fairly high up on that cost curve. So the question then is, if you put on a $30 ton tax or a $50 ton tax, and you reduce that, you build up the costs, the cash costs, by a few dollars per barrel. Well, if they are high cost now, they become higher costs after that. So it's never fun to be higher up the cost curve. And and there's always a marginal producer. So some project isn't going to happen as a result of that. For exactly the same logic that you see that some projects aren't happening now because the world price of oil has fallen from $105 to $50 over the last 6 months. But I think this is where carbon pricing is very cool. So one of the things that carbon pricing doesn't do is it doesn't take a position on who's going to produce. It says, look, we're going to price carbon at 30 bucks a ton or 40 bucks a ton or whatever the number is. And you now have an incentive to produce more cleanly, to reduce your emissions. You figure out how to do it. And maybe you can do it cheaply, maybe it's hard. And if you can do it more cheaply than somebody in some other jurisdiction who's facing the same carbon tax, maybe you will become a lower cost producer on that cost curve. And who knows where oil sands will be on that cost curve 5 years from now, or 10 years from now, or 20 years from now. But there will be an oil industry in the world for the next 30 or 40 or 50 years. We don't simply know where Alberta will be on that cost curve. So I think it's actually very difficult to make any kind of precise prediction about how a carbon price will either expand or contract Alberta's share of the world oil market. I think it's very, very difficult to do. But what you can predict is that if Alberta puts, or Canada, puts a carbon price in place and ramps it up slowly over time, that all of the incentives are put in place for Canadian oil companies to get better, more efficient, cleaner, and that's going to help them be in a better place on that world cost curve. I mean, we don't have the crystal ball to know the pace of technological change and the different pace in different parts of the country and how the technological change will respond precisely to different carbon prices. But that's the beauty of the carbon price. It doesn't make the decision about who produces or who doesn't. It sets the economic incentives in place and people make their own decisions. I think this is a huge issue. So we talk about this in our first report. We'll probably talk about it in future reports. And it goes under different labels. Sometimes it's called social license. Sometimes it's called market access. Sometimes it's called the social license to get market access. But I mean, we know, you know, that Canada is having a hard time getting pipelines built. Whether it is the Northern Gateway or the Energy East or the Keystone XL or others. I mean, there's challenges in building pipelines. Some of those are all in Canada, some of those are crossing international borders. Part of the opposition, part of the difficulty in building those pipelines is that the oil sands, the oil patch, but the oil sands in particular, has become a flashpoint. It's become a flashpoint. And I would say that Canada as a whole has not done a great job in terms of getting its greenhouse gas emissions under control. Our emissions are rising, they are not falling. Let me just put it that way. And so I think you can make a very coherent case that says if we actually had carbon pricing in place, whether it was Alberta or Western Canada or every province or Canada as a whole, if you had carbon pricing policies in place that were credible and that were comprehensive and that were actually effective at reducing greenhouse gas emissions, at least you could hope, and I think you could probably make a coherent case that there would be less opposition. Canada would be seen as being environmentally a better performer, and maybe there would be less opposition and maybe even more support for building those pipelines. So I think market access, the social license, I think that's very important. I think there is an opportunity for a grand bargain, and I hope it's not a lost or a wasted opportunity. But it seems to me there is an ideal opportunity, right? Because if we had sensible carbon pricing in place that was effective as well, you would think that NGOs would be happier with that. You would think that that's something that the oil patch could, by the arguments that I've just given you, the oil patch could say, well, we realize that this is not really threatening our bottom line that much, and we still have a very healthy future in the oil patch, and this will produce incentives for us to be cleaner. So you could absolutely imagine that grand bargain being struck. So I think there is an opportunity. My fear is that there may be parties to this grand bargain that are too extreme. in both directions. I think there are individuals out there who wouldn't accept that grand bargain because some of those individuals think that it's not enough to price carbon. We need to shut down the oil patch. I think that view is completely wrong, but I've met some of those people. There are also people on the other end who think that carbon pricing is ridiculous. And I mean, this is the drill baby drill view that says there are no problems here. There are only economic benefits. And so carbon pricing is too much. I mean, I think the reasonable middle is the reasonable middle. I mean, I think that's where common sense is, frankly. But I fear that there are those groups on the extremes that would not accept this as a grand bargain. Now, I hope that they are in small enough numbers that the grand bargain of that kind can be struck and it would be stable. Canadian provinces are very different, right? I mean, you don't need me to tell you that BC is a pretty different place than Manitoba and Quebec and Nova Scotia, but the truth is they're very different. Their economic structures are very different. Their energy mixes are very different, as you well know. Their political priorities are different. To me, those differences actually point to saying that whether you had provincial carbon pricing policies or a federal carbon pricing policy, in order to make sense, any sensible carbon pricing policy would have to pay attention to those differences. And so you start thinking about saying, well, if we do this federally, how would you do it federally and pay attention to those differences? Well, you're probably going to design the system differently in different provinces to recognize those different economic realities and the different energy mixes. And really importantly, there's the issue about the revenue. Any federal policy that generates revenue in BC or Manitoba or Quebec, and that revenue flows back to the center, is, I think, asking for a serious, serious opposition. The advantage of provincial carbon pricing is that both of those obstacles are just absolutely, neatly, simply, transparently sidestepped. You just say, well, provinces can design systems in their own way, and provinces can keep the revenues, and provinces can use the revenues in their own way. So what do we see now? We see that BC has a pretty squeaky clean textbook version carbon tax, and they've recycled all the revenues to personal and business income tax and some low income rebates. Alberta has a more complex system, more regulatory intensity based elements of pricing. The revenues that it does generate, which is very few, go into technological development. Quebec has a cap and trade system. This is a different system, designed in different ways, doing different things with the revenues than the other two. So to me, those are three really good examples of three very different provinces, three very different systems. Why? Because they're three very different provinces with three very different sets of economic and political priorities. So to me, the provincial approach is a natural approach to do it. And then an obvious question is, well, how about if we have 10 different provincial systems, one in each province, and they're different? And some people will say, well, that's just, an inefficient hodgepodge, and it's going to be a nightmare. Well, two comments. One is, over time, you could take those provincial systems and you could coordinate them, right? You don't have to coordinate every element of the system. You could actually produce a consistent carbon price, but you could have a different system that generates that consistent carbon price. I go back to what I think is the main obstacle, not just on carbon issues, just the main obstacle is this belief that you can't do better in both. You can't do better in environmental and economic at the same time. I don't know where that belief has come from, but I believe that belief is there in spades. I think it's absolutely pervasive, and I think it's absolutely wrong. It's a tough obstacle to overcome. Because in order to understand how you can do better, you got to get people to understand how our fiscal structures have evolved. And say, well, hold on, we have our fiscal structures have evolved to the point where, we're basically encouraging pollution by not taxing it, and we're discouraging all the things we like, and so this is crazy, so turn it around. But, how many people want to sit around and talk about fiscal policy, right? Not very many people want to do that, but that's the discussion you got to have. You got to get it to the point where people see that our fiscal structures could be rejigged, they could be re-engineered, and it would actually give us benefits in both directions. Better economy, better environment, they would go together. I think this is a massive education. Maybe all of the above. I mean, who takes the lead on any education? I don't actually know the answer to that. I mean, education in terms of primary schools is a provincial jurisdiction, but we have locally run school boards. Who actually takes the lead in this country on teaching us about the law of gravity? I don't know the answer to that, actually. You know, here we're talking about policy. I think everybody's got to do their bit. But I think we need, and I think we have, professional public servants who think about the public interest. I think we need more, better public servants. I mean, I think that's always true. I think we need think tanks that are thinking about these issues. I think we need university professors who are thinking about policy. One of my pet peeves in life is that we don't have enough university professors who care about policy. And I'm all in favor of publishing in academic journals that very few people read, but it would be nice if a higher fraction of our academics of all disciplines cared about policy. But we also need them to care about policy and to talk to the policymakers, which means we need more interaction between academics and governments. I mean, the two positions I had, special advisor to the governor of the bank and, you know, the Clifford Clark economist at the Department of Finance they were fabulous positions, and I was incredibly, incredibly lucky to have them, and I learned a huge amount about them. But there are very few of those positions in Ottawa or in the provincial capitals. We need more interaction between academics and governments, and academics and think tanks and governments, and business and academics and business and governments, and all of the above. We need more interaction, because that's the way you get the exchange of ideas and you get people to think through tough things. So all of that was a very long-winded way of saying I don't know the answer, but we just need more people talking about these issues.